Lang nerds, welcome to eLang Explained. This video is a part of our core curriculum series where we break down some of the key concepts and pieces of meta language from units 1 to 4 English language. So get excited for today's episode where we're going to be learning about the purposes and intents of formal language. So before we go any further, what are purposes and intents? Well, purposes and intents include the aims and goals of the language user. So anytime we're looking at a text and we're analysing purpose and intent, we're actually really carefully considering what does the language user want to achieve with their language? How is the language that's being used telling something to the audience about the identity, the values, the beliefs of the language user? And how does the language that's used reflect the relationship between the person who is using the language or the company, the group that's using their language, and their audience? Now, these are some of the formal purposes and intents that we can see often used by texts that have a formal register or a register that's mostly formal with elements of informality. Now, this list is taken straight from the VCAR English Language Study Design from 2024 to 2028. And this is a really great place to start, but it's important to remember that this list of purposes from our study design isn't a definitive list. So there are absolutely other purposes that you could apply to a text, but we're going to stick with the VCAR purposes and intents for today. So when you're trying to remember the formal purposes and intents, remember RBC Propmen, because our formal purposes and intents from the study design include reinforcing authority, building rapport, clarifying information, politeness strategies, reinforcing social distance, obfuscating information, promoting social harmony, manipulating information, establishing expertise, and negotiating social taboo. And some of you might be looking at this list, particularly if you've just watched our video on the informal purposes and intents. And you might be thinking to yourself, ooh, some of these look very familiar. And that's because they absolutely are. So it's important to remember that in our study design, there is some overlap between purpose and intent between those informal and formal texts. So purposes that can apply to a formal or informal text include purposes and intents like building rapport, politeness strategies, promoting social harmony, and negotiating social taboo. We're still going to go through all of our purposes and intents today, though, with that more formal focus. So now we're going to go through each of these purposes in a little bit more detail to talk about what kind of language reflects these different purposes and intents. So when we're thinking about that first purpose and intent of reinforcing authority, we're specifically thinking about texts that use language to highlight the status of the participant as someone who has control within the discourse. And this might be that they are the topic manager. They are the one who is responsible for initiating new topics, maintaining topics, and forming topic loops if anyone starts to digress from that topic. It also might be related to their role. And so this might be related to in interview texts where one of the participants is establishing their control over the way that the information is going to be presented or the way that particular ideas are going to be brought up within the discourse. Texts that have this purpose and intent are also using language to reflect the power of the participant, the person who's using that language, as very often the superordinate, the person who has the most power within the text. We have our purpose and intent of texts that have a purpose of building rapport are using language to reduce the social distance between the participants in a discourse and also to reflect that close relationship between our interlocutors. Next up, we have the purpose of clarifying information. Now, there are 3 formal purposes and intents that specifically relate to information. And it's really important to not get these confused or to overthink these purposes and intents. So this purpose about clarifying information really simply is all about using language features to make a specific piece of information or a key idea within the text even clearer for the audience to understand. So when we're clarifying information, we're aiming to make that single piece of information or key idea much more understandable and easier to access for the audience. Next up is our purpose and intent of politeness strategies. And this one is a little bit tricky because we've got that big umbrella term of politeness strategies, but this purpose and intent is really all about face. And if you're a keen green bean and you're interested in learning more about face, have a Google for Brown and Levinson's research, because that is a really detailed explanation of this concept that can be a little bit complicated at times. When we're thinking about politeness strategies, though, we're thinking specifically about texts that are using language to either maintain the positive face of a participant, to enhance that specific person's feelings of belonging and respect, or they're using language to challenge positive face and threaten those feelings of belonging and respect. For politeness strategies, we also have texts that have a purpose or intent of politeness strategies might be using language to maintain negative face and to enhance the specific person's feelings of autonomy and control and self-determination. But they equally might be using language to challenge the negative face of a specific person and challenge and threaten those feelings of autonomy, control, and self-determination. Anytime we're using this purpose of politeness strategies, it's really important that we specify, number one, are we talking about strategies that are maintaining or challenging? Number two, are we talking about positive or negative face? And then number three, which specific person or group are being targeted with this language? For example, a text that has a purpose of politeness strategies is the warnings that you can currently see at Luna Park before you get on any of the roller coasters, like the Scenic Railway. And they say things like, persons with the following conditions are advised not to ride, and then they list the conditions. Now, this is a text that absolutely is challenging the negative face of people who are interested in riding the Scenic Railway at Luna Park, because they're giving that really clear information about who is suggested to not ride. Then we have the purpose or intent of reinforcing social distance. And when we see this purpose or intent in a text, we're specifically focusing on texts that use language to increase the social distance between participants, but also use language to emphasize that social distance and some very clear boundaries between the participants in a discourse. Then we've got our second purpose and intent that is all about information. But this purpose isn't clarifying information. Here, we're obfuscating information. And obfuscating is another one of those purposes that can be a little bit tricky, but it's really important not to overthink. So when we're thinking about texts that obfuscate information, we're specifically focusing on texts that use language to de-emphasize specific ideas, or make a specific piece of information or a key idea less clear and less focused on within a text. And politicians are experts at obfuscating information. To be fair, they're also experts at clarifying, manipulating, and obfuscating information, but particularly obfuscating information, because this includes texts where someone is presenting an idea, but they're kind of using language to hide it a little bit, to cloak their true meaning a little bit, to make that original idea a little bit more difficult for the audience to understand for a very specific reason. Then we've got our purpose or intent of promoting social harmony. And here we're specifically thinking about texts that use language to reflect shared values and goals in society, but also texts that use language to reflect the values of a respectful and understanding Australian society. Next up, we've got our last purpose related to information, and this one is manipulating information. Now, before we go any further, it's important to address the connotations here, because manipulating often has negative connotations. But as a purpose or intent, manipulating information is all about the strategic presentation of information. And so when we're looking at a text that manipulates information, we're not necessarily looking at a text that is using language in a bad way, but we are looking at a text that is strategically presenting specific pieces of information so that they'll be interpreted in a specific and desirable way by other participants in the discourse. Next up, we've got the purpose of establishing expertise. And texts that aim to establish expertise are using language to both establish the participant as a trustworthy source of information on a specific topic, and to reflect the participant's identity as someone who is knowledgeable in this specific field. So while it might not be the main purpose or intent of this video, there definitely is a purpose and intent here for this text of establishing the expertise of Elang Explained. Because throughout this video, hopefully you've heard language that is aiming to present Elang Explained as a trustworthy source of information on the specific topic of VCE English language, but even more specifically, the formal purposes and intents. And hopefully you've also heard some language that reflects Elang Explained's identity as a group who are knowledgeable in the specific field of VCE English language. Then we've got our purpose and intent of negotiating social taboo. And this is one of those purposes that you might remember from the informal purposes and intents. Because when we see a text that's using language to negotiate social taboo, this text is using language features to discuss a topic that is a little bit socially uncomfortable to discuss. In most formal texts, that means we're going to be seeing the use of euphemisms but in more informal texts, we often see those dysphemisms that make this taboo topic less acceptable to discuss and a little bit more uncomfortable for the participants. Now, those are all of the purposes and intents listed in the study design. And while it's important to remember that there are other purposes and intents you absolutely can use because that study design list isn't definitive, I always find myself going back to the list from the study design because it is so clear. At the same time, it's really important to remember that the purposes and intents stated here in this presentation are just sentence starters. And so like we explained for politeness strategies, if you're going to use any of these purposes and intents in your analysis, it's really important that you're specific. Remember that this is a sentence starter, so it can't be the whole sentence. If you were talking about that purpose or intent of establishing expertise, it's really important to say whose expertise is established and in which field. The next important thing to remember is that your analysis needs to be specific and link each purpose or intent back to the set text. So it's really important to avoid general analysis of purpose and intents that could apply to any text. And it is even more important to make sure that you're always in every point of analysis that you make, whether it's on purpose and intent or another key sociolinguistic feature, that you're always linking back to the defining features of the set text. Next up, the third key thing to remember is that one text can have multiple purposes and intents. So this can mean that the text itself has an overall primary and secondary purpose and intent, or if you've got a text with multiple speakers, it might mean that you identify a purpose or intent for each of the speakers, each of the participants in that discourse. And the lucky last thing to remember about being specific when we're analysing purpose is that sometimes students will get function and purpose and intent confused. Remember, function is that more general statement. There are 6 functions in English language. You can remember them with the mnemonic MP-PERC. And they are much more general than our very specific purposes and intents. Lots of texts will have a referential function, but this text has a specific purpose to clarify information about the meaning of formal purposes and intents that are listed in the VCAA English Language Study Design for an audience of VCE English language students. So, those are the key things to remember when you're analysing the formal purposes and intents. As I've said a couple of times throughout this video though, this is just our starting point. This isn't a definitive list. And so if there's another purpose or intent that you often see in formal texts, make sure to add it in the comments below. But that's all we have time for today. Remember to be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time for more Elang Explained.